A day heavy with expectations, 1,500 words. Marita Daniels stood in her sunlit kitchen, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the glass of the window, the morning light catching the edges of her braided hair. At 42, Marita had an air of quiet authority. Her sharp, perceptive eyes carried the wisdom born of years navigating a system often rigged against her. But today they also carried a flicker of unease. She glanced down at the table where she had laid out the documents for today's case. The headlines from the past week flashed through her mind. Civil Rights versus Vixton County Police Department. It was one of the biggest cases of her career, a legal battle that exposed systemic racial discrimination within local law enforcement. This was more than just a court case. It was a chance for justice to be served on a grand scale. Yet Marita knew all too well that cases like these didn't simply challenge institutions. They often painted targets on those brave enough to preside over them. On the edge of her table sat a photograph of her grandmother, Leela, taken in the early 60s during a march for civil rights. In the picture, Leila's face was fierce with determination, her hands gripping a sign that read, "Equality Now." Marita traced the photo's edge with her finger, drawing strength from the image. "I carry this torch for us all," she thought. Marita finished her coffee, buttoned her tailored blazer, and folded her black judicial robe neatly over her arm. Though her title came with respect in some circles, she understood the weight of skepticism that others harbored, people who couldn't reconcile her being a black woman in such a position of authority. As she locked her door and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, Marita felt the familiar mix of pride and pressure settle over her shoulders. She walked briskly to her car, each step deliberate, her briefcase swinging lightly by her side. The courthouse was only a 15-minute drive away, but the significance of what awaited her made the journey feel much longer. Meanwhile, on the steps of the courthouse, Officer Brian Marks adjusted his crisp blue uniform. At 27, Brian was relatively new to the force and eager to prove himself. His superiors had described him as ambitious, though his fellow officers often joked that he tried too hard. Today was his first solo assignment guarding the courthouse entrance. He intended to make it flawless. Brian had grown up idolizing the police officers on television who stopped criminals with unwavering courage. But the world wasn't as black and white as he'd thought back then. Still, he held tightly to his belief in the badge, seeing it as a symbol of integrity. Yet beneath his polished exterior, Brian carried biases he hadn't acknowledged or even recognized. As he scanned the growing crowd outside the courthouse, Brian's stance stiffened. He caught sight of a group of young men, dressed in hoodies and baggy jeans, approaching the entrance. His hand instinctively hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his holstered weapon. His sharp gaze followed their every move until they passed without incident. "Gotta stay alert," he muttered to himself, masking the tension with resolve. Inside the courthouse, the usual hum of activity filled the air. Lawyers flipping through thick case files, clerks bustling about with paperwork, and reporters staking out key positions for their stories. But one thing was different today. Whispers about the high-profile civil rights case reached every corner. It wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning. Marita parked her car in her usual spot, slipping on her heels before stepping out with her briefcase and robes. Her thoughts were already deep into the case, her mind rehearsing every detail, every argument, every possible objection. She barely noticed the sharp chill of the morning air as she approached the courthouse steps. But as she ascended, she was abruptly stopped. "Ma'am, hold it right there," came a sharp voice. Marita looked up to see Officer Marks standing rigidly before her, his expression stern. His hand rested on his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to make a statement. "Excuse me," Marita replied, startled but calm. "This is a restricted area. I need to see some identification," Brian said, his voice firm but laced with an edge of suspicion. Marita tilted her head slightly, surprised. She gestured to the black robe folded over her arm. "I'm Judge Daniels," she said evenly. "I preside over this courthouse." Brian's eyes narrowed. Her calm confidence irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. "Do you have ID to prove that?" Marita paused, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "I left my badge in my chambers, officer. If you let me through, you're welcome to verify with the clerk inside." Brian crossed his arms. "I can't just take your word for it. For all I know, that robe could be a costume." Marita took a deep breath, her patience being tested. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs growing louder as they recognized her. A woman in the back whispered, "That's Judge Daniels. What's going on?" But Brian didn't notice. His focus was singular, his suspicion unwavering. "I'm going to need you to step back, ma'am. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to remove you from the premises." The air grew thick with tension. Marita's voice, when it came, was steady but resolute. "Officer Marks, you are standing between me and my courtroom. If you continue down this path, you'll regret it." Her words struck a nerve. Brian's posture stiffened further, and he reached for his radio. "Backup requested at the courthouse steps." "We've got a situation," he said into the device. The crowd's murmurs turned to open protests. "She's the judge," one man shouted. Another woman yelled, "Let her through." But Brian's judgment had been clouded by his assumptions, and he couldn't see past them. "Ma'am, this is your last warning," he said, his voice tight. Marita stood her ground, her expression calm but firm. Slowly, she unfolded her robe and draped it over her shoulders, the stark black fabric falling into place. The crowd hushed as the transformation took place. "If you truly want to escalate this, Officer Marks," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry over the crowd, "I suggest you call the clerk inside right now and ask them who I am." Brian hesitated. The weight of the crowd's stares and Marita's unyielding composure began to sink in. He fumbled for his radio again, calling into dispatch. Can someone verify a Judge Daniels? Claims to be presiding here today." The response came quickly. "Judge Daniels is on the docket for the civil rights case. She's expected." Brian froze, his cheeks burning with humiliation. Slowly, he lowered his radio and looked at Marita. I'm sorry, Mom," he stammered. "I didn't." "Understand," Marita interrupted, her tone sharp but not unkind. "You didn't understand, and that's the problem." Brian stepped aside, his head bowed as Marita swept past him into the courthouse. The crowd began to disperse, but the whispers lingered, filling the air with a palpable sense of indignation and disbelief. Inside, Marita paused for a moment to steady herself. The confrontation had been demeaning, but it wasn't unfamiliar. She had dealt with people doubting her authority her entire career. But today, it felt heavier, perhaps because it had come from someone who was supposed to uphold the law alongside her. As she walked to her chambers to prepare for the case, Marita couldn't help but think of her grandmother again. The fight never ends, she thought, but neither does the progress. The morning's events left Brian shaken. He couldn't focus, the scene playing over and over in his mind. His actions hadn't just been a mistake. They had revealed something deeper, something uncomfortable. And now he wasn't sure how to make it right. Unmasking the layers of justice, 1,500 words. Marita Daniels stepped into her chambers, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a satisfying click. The familiar space, lined with law books and personal mementos, offered a moment of refuge. Yet the confrontation with Officer Marks lingered in her mind, leaving an uncomfortable residue. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe as she seated herself at the desk. Today would require not just her intellect, but every ounce of her emotional resilience. Her judicial assistant, Sarah, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, entered briskly, carrying a thick folder of documents. "The courtroom's buzzing," Sarah said without preamble. The morning's drama made its way inside. Marita raised an eyebrow. "I assume the whispers aren't about the case docket." "No, ma'am. It's about you and Officer Marks." Apparently, word spreads fast when a judge is held up at the courthouse steps. Marita sighed, leaning back in her chair. It was bound to happen sooner or later, she said. These robes don't make me immune to assumptions. They just make the fallout louder. Sarah hesitated, her professionalism warring with personal concern. Do you want me to say something to the press? Spin it before it becomes a narrative. Marita shook her head. No need. Let it simmer. This case will draw enough attention on its own. Besides, the real story today is justice, or at least, it should be. Sarah nodded and set the folder down on the desk. All the filings for today. The civil rights case is first, as you know. And just a heads up, the gallery is packed. Marita gave a small, rueful smile. I expected no less. Let's show them what justice looks like. Meanwhile, Officer Brian Marks sat slumped in the precinct break room, his usually polished composure fractured. His partner for the day, Officer Ramirez, poured coffee into two mismatched mugs and slid one across the table toward him. You look like someone ran over your dog, Ramirez said, taking the sip of her coffee. What happened? Brian stared into his mug, the swirling steam doing little to distract him from his thoughts. I screwed up, he said finally. Big time. Ramirez tilted her head, genuinely curious. How big? Brian hesitated, his shame bubbling to the surface. I stopped someone outside the courthouse this morning. She wasn't dressed formally, didn't have ID on her. I thought she didn't belong. And, Ramirez prompted, her brows knitting together. She was Judge Daniels. The words hung in the air like a weight between them. Ramirez let out a low whistle. Ouch. That's a career stumble if I've ever heard one. What did she do? Brian sighed, rubbing his temples. She called me out in front of everyone. Calm, but firm. And then she walked in, like the professional she is, while I stood there looking like an idiot. Ramirez studied him for a moment. What's eating you more? The fact that you made a mistake, or the reason why you made it? Brian shot her a sharp look, but her question hit home. I don't know, he admitted. I don't think I'm a bad guy. I thought I was being cautious. Being cautious is fine, Ramirez said, her tone softening. But you've got to ask yourself, were you cautious because of the situation, or because of who she is? There's a difference. Brian slumped further in his chair. Ramirez leaned back, giving him space to think. You've got two choices now, she said after a long silence. You can let this moment define you, or you can learn from it. Figure out why you reacted the way you did and do better next time. It's up to you. Back in the courtroom, Marita ascended the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff called the session to order. The plaintiff's attorney, a young black man named Terrence Graves, stood ready, his face a mix of determination and calm focus. On the other side of the aisle sat the defense attorney, an older man with silver hair and a seasoned expression. The case was clear. The plaintiff, a black teenager named Andrew Willis, had been falsely arrested by local police officers who claimed he fit the description of a robbery suspect. Andrew had been walking home from basketball practice when he was stopped, handcuffed, and detained for hours before being released without charge. The officer's justification boiled down to a vague description: a tall black male wearing a hoodie. As Marita read through the case summary, the weight of its implications pressed heavily on her. This wasn't just about Andrew. It was about a system that allowed such mistakes to happen repeatedly, often with devastating consequences. Mr. Graves, Marita said, addressing the plaintiff's attorney, you may begin your opening statement. Terrence stepped forward, his voice clear and steady. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, this case is about accountability. It's about a young man whose rights were violated simply because of the color of his skin. Andrew Willis was not a suspect. He was a kid walking home. And yet, he was treated like a criminal. Marita listened intently, her expression neutral, but her mind working through every word. As Terrence continued, she glanced at Andrew. who sat quietly at the plaintiff's table. His eyes were downcast, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The weight of the ordeal was visible in his hunched shoulders. When the defense attorney, Charles Whitman, rose to deliver his statement, his tone was measured but dismissive. "Your Honor, this case is built on assumptions. My clients acted within the scope of their duties, responding to a credible report of a crime. They made an honest mistake, and while unfortunate, it does not constitute a violation of Mr. Willis's rights." Marita's eyes narrowed slightly. The word mistake echoed in her mind. She couldn't ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience that morning. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing on the evidence and arguments presented. At the back of the courtroom, Officer Marks stood silently, assigned to provide security. He watched the proceedings unfold, each word cutting deeper into his conscience. Andrew's story felt uncomfortably familiar. A young man judged not for his actions but for his appearance. Brian's jaw tightened as he remembered his own actions with Judge Daniels earlier that day. For the first time, he saw himself not as the protector he aspired to be, but as part of the problem. It was a sobering realization, one that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. As the morning wore on, witnesses were called to the stand. A store clerk described the robbery suspect in vague terms, his testimony riddled with inconsistencies. Another officer testified about the arrest, his language clinical and detached. But when Andrew took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Andrew spoke softly but firmly, his voice tinged with both pain and determination. "I was walking home, like I do every day after practice. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But when the officers stopped me, they didn't ask questions. They didn't explain. They just cuffed me and shoved me in the back of a car." "Did they ever apologize?" Terrence asked. Andrew shook his head. "No. They just let me go after a few hours, like it didn't matter." Marita's gaze lingered on Andrew as he spoke, her heart aching for the young man who had been forced to carry a burden he didn't deserve. She glanced briefly at Officer Marks in the back of the room, wondering if he, too, was drawing the same painful connections. When the court recessed for lunch, Marita returned to her chambers, her mind racing. The weight of the case, coupled with the morning's confrontation, left her feeling drained. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and to her surprise, Officer Marks stepped inside. His usually confident demeanor was gone, replaced by visible unease. He removed his hat, clutching it in his hands like a lifeline. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low. "I wanted to apologize. For this morning, I made a mistake." Marita regarded him silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Go on," she said. Brian took a deep breath. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I thought I was being cautious, but I see now that I wasn't fair. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Marita leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" Brian nodded slowly. "I do. It wasn't just about you, Judge Daniels. It's about everyone I interact with in this uniform. I need to be better. I want to be better." Marita studied him for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step, Officer Marks. The real question is, what will you do next?" Brian's jaw tightened with resolve. "I'll figure it out, and I'll make sure it never happens again." Marita nodded again, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "See that you do. Because justice doesn't just happen in this courtroom. It starts out there, with people like you." Unmasking the layers of justice, Brian Marks stood in Judge Daniels' chambers, her words hanging heavy in the air. He shifted uncomfortably, gripping his hat tightly in his hands. The small office, adorned with certificates and awards, seemed to amplify his unease. The space wasn't just a room. It was a testament to years of hard work, resilience, and integrity. Everything about it reminded Brian of what he had violated that morning. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally, his voice shaky but sincere. "But I want to make amends. If there's anything I can do." Marita raised a hand, silencing him. "Officer Marks, this isn't about me accepting your apology or finding a way to make it right. It's about recognizing a larger issue." She leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "Do you understand how easily your actions could have escalated this morning? How they could have become yet another example of systemic bias? How they could have ended someone's career, or worse, their life?" Brian nodded, shame flushing his face. "I do now, Your Honor, and I'm not proud of it." Marita sat back in her chair, studying him. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of activity in the courthouse. Then she spoke again, her tone measured but firm. "Officer Marks, let me tell you something my grandmother taught me. She used to say, the hardest battle is not changing the world, it's changing yourself. Do you think you're ready for that battle?" Brian swallowed hard. "Yes, Mom." Marita nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "We'll see." The afternoon session of the trial began with heightened anticipation. The courtroom, now packed to capacity, buzzed with a tension that was almost tangible. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, their pens scratching against paper as they documented every word. Onlookers leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every detail. Marita presided over the proceedings with her characteristic calm authority. She had seen too many cases where the lines between justice and prejudice blurred, and she was determined to keep this one clear. But the weight of the morning's events stayed with her, feeding her determination to handle the case with even greater precision. Terrence Graves, the plaintiff's attorney, resumed his questioning of Andrew Willis, the young man at the heart of the case. "Andrew," he said gently, "can you describe how you felt during the arrest?" Andrew hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "I felt scared, humiliated, like no matter what I said or did, it wouldn't matter. They didn't see me. They just saw what they thought I was." Terrence nodded, his expression empathetic. "And how has this experience affected you since then?" Andrew's gaze dropped to the floor. "I can't walk home anymore without looking over my shoulder. I used to love basketball, but now, I don't even want to go to practice. It's like they took a part of me I can't get back." Marita watched as the young man spoke, her heart aching for him. She glanced briefly at Officer Marks, who was standing at the back of the room. His face was pale, his expression pained. It was clear the testimony was hitting him hard. When the defense took their turn, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Charles Whitman, the defense attorney, was known for his sharp tactics and no-nonsense demeanor. He approached the witness stand with a confident stride. "Mr. Willis," Whitman began, his voice smooth and calculated, "you claim that you were stopped unfairly. But isn't it true that the officers were responding to a call about a robbery in progress?" Andrew nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but—" "And isn't it also true," Whitman continued, cutting him off, "that the description given to the officers matched your appearance? Tall, black male, wearing a hoodie." Andrew's voice faltered. "I guess, but that doesn't mean I did anything." Whitman pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "Mr. Willis, would you agree that the officers were simply doing their job, that they had a duty to investigate a potential suspect?" Andrew looked helplessly at Terrence, who rose to object. "Your Honor, the defense is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Marita said firmly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. She turned to Whitman, her gaze stern. "Mr. Whitman, rephrase your question or move on." Whitman inclined his head slightly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Of course, Your Honor." He stepped back, his eyes never leaving Andrew. No further questions. As Andrew returned to his seat, Marita felt a surge of frustration. The defense's approach was clinical, reducing a deeply personal experience to a matter of procedural justification. But this was the reality of the courtroom, a place where facts and strategy often overshadowed humanity. During a brief recess, Marita took a moment to collect her thoughts. The trial was emotionally draining, not just for the parties involved, but for everyone in the room. As she sipped a glass of water in her chambers, there was another knock at her door. This time, it was Terence Graves. "Your Honor," he began, stepping inside, "I just wanted to thank you for your patience today. I know this case is complicated." Marita set her glass down and gestured for him to sit. "Complicated doesn't begin to describe it, Mr. Graves, but that's why we're here, to untangle the complications and find the truth." Terence nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we're getting closer to that truth?" Marita gave him a measured look. "That depends on what you bring to the table tomorrow." As the day drew to a close, Marita returned to the bench for the final moments of the session. She addressed the court with her usual composure, outlining the schedule for the following day and reminding everyone of the importance of impartiality. But as she dismissed the court, her gaze lingered on Officer Marks, who stood at the back of the room. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Marita saw a flicker of something she hadn't noticed before, an earnest desire to change. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened that morning, but it was a start. In the quiet of the courthouse corridors, Brian Marks leaned against a wall, his thoughts racing. The trial, with its raw emotion and undeniable truths, had shaken him to his core. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of his badge in a way he never had before. He replayed Andrew's testimony in his mind, the young man's words echoing in his ears. "They didn't see me. They just saw what they thought I was." Brian realized that he, too, had fallen into the same trap, not just with Judge Daniels, but likely with countless others he had encountered on the job. Ramirez's words from earlier came back to him. "You've got to ask yourself, were you cautious because of the situation or because of who they are?" For Brian, the answer was clear, and it was one he could no longer ignore. As the courthouse emptied and the day came to an end, Marita sat alone in her chambers, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She thought of Andrew, of the courage it took for him to tell this story. She thought of Brian, and the humility it took for him to confront his actions. And she thought of her grandmother, whose legacy continued to guide her. The hardest battle is not changing the world, it's changing yourself. Marita closed her eyes, allowing the weight of the day to settle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. The fight for justice was far from over, but Marita Daniels was ready for it. Reckoning and reflection. 1,500 words. The following morning, the courthouse was already bustling with activity before sunrise. Spectators, reporters, and activists packed the steps, their presence a testament to the gravity of the case. Inside, the tension was palpable, the weight of unfinished justice hanging in the air like a storm cloud. For Judge Marita Daniels, it was just another day, though she knew it would be anything but ordinary. Marita arrived earlier than usual, hoping to ground herself before the day's proceedings. She sat in her chambers, the soft hum of her desk lamp illuminating the room. The morning stillness provided a rare moment of clarity. The trial was no longer just about Andrew Willis. It was becoming a microcosm of the larger fight against systemic injustice. Every question, every ruling, every nuance would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. Her assistant, Sarah, entered quietly, carrying a fresh stack of documents. "Morning, Your Honor," she said, setting the papers on Marita's desk. "Thought you'd want to see this before we begin." "What's this?" Marita asked, flipping through the pages. "Officer testimony," Sarah replied. "The defense plans to call Officer Drew Hastings to the stand this morning. He's one of the arresting officers in Andrew's case." Marita's brow furrowed. "Hastings," she murmured. The name triggered a memory, a previous complaint lodged against him for excessive force, though it had been dismissed. She made a mental note to tread carefully. Officers like Hastings often knew how to toe the line between justification and overreach. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else," she said, her tone more subdued. "Officer Marks left this for you." Marita glanced up. Sarah handed her a folded note, its edges slightly crumpled. "He asked me to give it to you directly." Marita unfolded the note and read its contents. "Your Honor, I wanted to express my gratitude for how you handled our interaction yesterday. I've spent the night reflecting, and I see now how my actions contributed to a larger issue. I'm committed to understanding my biases and doing better, not just for my career, but for the people I serve. I hope today's proceedings remind us all why justice must be fair, unbiased, and unwavering. Thank you for showing me the dignity I failed to show you. Sincerely, Officer Brian Marks." Marita exhaled deeply, folding the note and placing it in her desk drawer. It wasn't forgiveness she felt, but something closer to hope. Marks was young and clearly still learning. Perhaps his experience could become a turning point, not just for him, but for others who watched him grow from it. In the courtroom, the session began promptly at 9:00 a.m. The atmosphere was electric, every seat in the gallery filled, with additional spectators standing at the back. The stakes were clear. This trial was about more than one young man's experience. It was about challenging a system that had perpetuated similar injustices for generations. The defense called Officer Hastings to the stand. He walked in with a confident stride, his uniform crisp and his demeanor stoic. As he took the oath and seated himself, his expression revealed nothing. Hastings was a seasoned officer, accustomed to the scrutiny that came with high-profile cases. The defense attorney, Charles Whitman, began his questioning. "Officer Hastings, could you walk us through the events leading to Mr. Willis's arrest?" "Certainly," Hastings replied, his voice even. "We received a call about a robbery in progress at a convenience store. The suspect was described as a tall black male wearing a hoodie. When we arrived in the vicinity, we saw Mr. Willis walking down the street, matching that description." "And what actions did you take?" Whitman pressed. "We approached him, asked him to stop, and he appeared nervous. When he didn't immediately comply, we detained him for questioning." Whitman nodded. "In your professional opinion, were your actions justified?" "Yes, they were," Hastings said firmly. "Given the circumstances, we had reason to believe Mr. Willis might be the suspect." Whitman turned to the jury, his expression triumphant, before addressing the court. "No further questions, Your Honor." Terence Graves stood next, his movements deliberate as he approached the witness stand. His expression was calm, but his tone carried an edge. "Officer Hastings, you stated that Mr. Willis appeared nervous. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Hastings shifted slightly in his seat. He avoided eye contact and seemed agitated. "Is it possible," Graves continued, "that a young man being approached by armed officers might feel nervous, regardless of whether he's guilty or innocent?" Hastings hesitated. "I suppose that's possible." Graves nodded. "Let's talk about the description you received. Tall black male wearing a hoodie. How many individuals in that neighborhood might fit that description?" Hastings frowned. "I couldn't say for certain." "Would you agree that it's a vague description?" Graves pressed. "It's what we had to work with," Hastings replied, his tone defensive. Graves leaned in slightly. "Officer Hastings, are you aware of any other evidence that directly links Mr. Willis to the robbery?" "No," Hastings admitted reluctantly. "But the description is not evidence," Graves interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "It's an assumption. And assumptions, Officer Hastings, can lead to mistakes. Isn't that right?" Hastings's jaw tightened. "I suppose so." "No further questions," Graves said, stepping back to his table. At the back of the courtroom, Officer Marks watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Hastings's testimony was a painful reminder of how easily bias could be justified under the guise of procedure. Marks thought about his own actions with Judge Daniels, how he too had relied on assumptions rather than facts. For the first time, he began to see the full scope of the problem. It wasn't just about individual mistakes. It was about a system that allowed those mistakes to happen repeatedly, with little accountability. As the trial continued, the plaintiff's side introduced a surprise witness, the store clerk who had initially called in the robbery. A petite woman in her early 50s, she appeared nervous as she took the stand. Terence Graves wasted no time. "Ms. Carter," he began, "you were the one who reported the robbery. Could you describe the suspect you saw?" She nodded hesitantly. "He was tall, wearing a hoodie. I didn't see his face clearly." Graves leaned forward. "Did you see Mr. Willis's face that day?" She shook her head. "No." "So, to be clear," Graves said, his tone sharp, "you cannot confirm that Mr. Willis is the person you saw. Is that correct?" "That's correct," she admitted. Graves turned to the jury, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Miss Carter, why did you call the police that day?" The woman hesitated. Because I thought he looked suspicious." "And what made him look suspicious?" Graves asked. She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "He was wearing a hoodie." The courtroom fell silent. Graves stepped back, allowing her words to linger. No further questions. As the day drew to a close, Judge Daniels recessed the court until the following morning. The gallery emptied slowly, the weight of the trial's revelations pressing heavily on everyone present. Marita remained seated on the bench, watching as the attorneys gathered their papers and the clerks began tidying the room. At the back of the courtroom, Officer Marks lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the empty witness stand. He knew he needed to speak with Judge Daniels again, not for her forgiveness, but to seek her guidance. He had questions now, questions he didn't know how to answer on his own. Back in her chambers, Marita sat alone, her thoughts racing. The trial was progressing, but the deeper questions it raised felt unresolved. How many times had cases like this gone unnoticed, unchallenged? And how many more would it take before real change occurred? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Officer Marks. "Your Honor," he said quietly, stepping inside. "I know you're busy, but I wanted to ask, how do you keep fighting this fight when it feels like the system is stacked against you?" Marita studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because giving up isn't an option, Officer Marks. Not for me, and not for anyone who believes in justice. The system may be flawed, but it can be changed. And that change starts with each of us." Marks nodded, her words settling deeply within him. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of purpose, a sense that his role in the system could be part of the solution, rather than the problem. Confronting the system. The sun rose on another crisp autumn morning, bathing the courthouse in an amber glow. Outside, a growing crowd of protesters gathered, their chants echoing across the plaza. Signs reading "Justice for Andre" and "End Racial Profiling" bobbed above the sea of determined faces. News vans lined the street, reporters jostling for position to capture the atmosphere. The trial of Andrew Willis had become more than a local case. It was now a focal point in the national conversation on race and policing. Inside, the courtroom felt heavy with anticipation. Judge Marita Daniels took her seat on the bench, her expression calm but focused. She scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces, the plaintiff's team, the defense, and the rows of spectators hanging on every detail. At the back of the room stood Officer Brian Marks, assigned to security duty once again. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the proceedings, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Brian's conversation with Judge Daniels the night before had unsettled him. Her words, simple yet profound, echoed in his mind. The system may be flawed, but it can be changed. And that change starts with each of us. He wanted to believe it was true, but the enormity of the problem felt overwhelming. How could one person, especially someone as inexperienced as him, begin to make a difference? As the court came to order, the defense called its final witness. Captain Martin Steele, a high-ranking officer in the Vixton County Police Department. Steele was a man of imposing stature, his uniform adorned with medals and commendations. He exuded confidence as he took the stand, his demeanor projecting authority. The defense attorney, Charles Whitman, wasted no time. Captain Steele, can you speak to the policies and procedures in place for identifying and detaining suspects? Of course, Steele replied, his voice deep and steady. Our department follows strict guidelines to ensure public safety while respecting the rights of individuals. Officers are trained to act based on evidence and reasonable suspicion. Whitman nodded approvingly. In your professional opinion, were Officers Hastings and Miller following protocol when they detained Mr. Willis? Steele's response was unwavering. Yes, they were. They acted on a credible report and followed procedure to the letter. Whitman turned to the jury, his tone authoritative. Thank you, Captain. No further questions. Terence Graves rose from his seat, his movements deliberate as he approached the witness stand. His expression was calm but sharp, like a predator circling its prey. Captain Steele, Graves began, you mentioned that your officers acted on a credible report. Can you define credible in this context? Steele's confidence didn't waver. A credible report is one that provides sufficient detail to justify an investigation. And in this case, Graves continued, the detail was a tall black male wearing a hoodie. Is that correct? Steele hesitated briefly. Yes, that was the description provided. Graves nodded. Would you consider that description sufficient to justify detaining someone? Steele leaned forward slightly, his tone defensive. Given the circumstances, yes. The officers were responding to a potential threat. Graves pressed on, his voice gaining an edge. Captain Steele, are you aware that according to the demographics of the area, nearly half of the young men in that neighborhood could fit that description? Steele's jaw tightened. I wasn't aware of that specific statistic. Graves stepped closer. Then how can you justify targeting Mr. Willis based on such a vague description? How is that not profiling? Steele's composure began to crack. Profiling suggests intent to discriminate. My officers were simply doing their job. Graves's voice rose slightly, his words cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Doing their job, or perpetuating a system that disproportionately targets people of color under the guise of public safety. The room fell silent, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Steele shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. We don't target anyone. We follow the law. Graves paused, letting the tension build before delivering his final blow. And yet, Captain Steele, the law seems to target the same people over and over again. Isn't that worth examining? Steele didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Graves returned to his seat, the faintest trace of a satisfied smile on his lips. As the trial recessed for lunch, the gallery buzzed with whispered conversations. The weight of the morning's testimony had left an indelible mark, and the tension was palpable. Marita Daniels retreated to her chambers, seeking a moment of quiet reflection before the next round of proceedings. She sat at her desk, staring at the stack of files before her but unable to focus. The trial had exposed deep cracks in the foundation of the justice system. Cracks she had known were there but rarely seen laid so bare. She thought of Andra, of the courage it took for him to stand up against a system that had failed him. And she thought of Officer Marks, whose journey towards self-awareness was just beginning. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Sarah, her assistant, with an update. Your Honor, there's someone here to see you. Officer Marks. Marita raised an eyebrow. Send him in. Brian entered hesitantly, his hat in his hands. He looked more nervous than she had ever seen him, his usual air of confidence replaced by uncertainty. Your Honor, he began, his voice low, I wanted to thank you again for speaking with me last night. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. Marita gestured for him to sit. And Brian hesitated, then met her gaze. And I want to do better, but I don't know where to start. Marita leaned back in her chair, studying him. The fact that you're asking that question is a start. Officer Marks. But real change requires more than just good intentions. It requires action. Brian nodded. I get that. I feel like I've been blind to so much. And now that I see it, I don't know how to make a difference. Marita's expression softened. You start by listening, by educating yourself, by challenging the biases you've been taught to accept as normal. And most importantly, by using your position to uplift others, not tear them down. Brian absorbed her words, a spark of determination lighting in his eyes. I want to be part of the solution, he said quietly. I don't want to be another cog in a broken system. Marita smiled faintly. Then hold yourself accountable, Officer Marks, and hold those around you accountable too. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts with people like you recognizing the power you have to make a difference. The afternoon session resumed with closing arguments. Terence Graves delivered a passionate summation, imploring the jury to see beyond procedure and recognize the humanity of his client. This trial isn't just about Andrew Willis, Graves said, his voice steady but emotional. It's about every young man who's been judged not for who they are but for what they look like. It's about holding a system accountable for the harm it causes when it allows prejudice to masquerade as protocol. The defense, in contrast, focused on legality and procedure, emphasizing the need for officers to act decisively in uncertain situations. As the jury deliberated, the courtroom emptied, leaving Marita alone on the bench. She stared at the empty witness stand, her mind racing. The verdict would be significant, but the larger battle loomed beyond the confines of her courtroom. At the back of the room, Officer Marks lingered, watching her. For the first time, he saw the toll her position took, the quiet weight she carried as a black woman in a system that often resisted change. He made a silent vow to honor the lesson she had taught him, not just with words but with actions. Outside, the protesters continued their chants, their voices rising into the autumn sky. The fight for justice was far from over, but in that courthouse, seeds of change had been planted. Confronting the system, the courtroom remained silent as the jury left to deliberate. Judge Marita Daniels watched them file out, her face impassive, though her thoughts churned beneath the surface. These moments, when justice hung in the balance, were the most difficult. She could only hope the evidence and arguments presented would guide the jurors to the right conclusion. The gallery had mostly cleared, leaving only a handful of reporters and curious onlookers. Outside, the chants of protesters filtered faintly through the courthouse walls. The rhythmic cadence of their voices carried a mix of hope and frustration, a reflection of the stakes at hand. Marita took a deep breath, rising from the bench. She signaled to Sarah, who approached quickly. Sarah, make sure I get the jury's decision the moment it's ready, Marita said, her voice calm but firm. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, gathering her notes and retreating. Marita stepped down from the bench, her judicial robe swaying gently as she exited the courtroom. A quiet meeting. Back in her chambers, Marita allowed herself a moment to breathe. She loosened her robes, draping them neatly over a chair before sitting at her desk. The trial had been emotionally exhausting, and the weight of her role felt heavier than ever. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Come in, she said. The door opened, and Officer Brian Marks stepped inside. He seemed hesitant, as though unsure whether he belonged there. He clutched his hat tightly, his knuckles white against the brim. Your Honor, Brian began, his voice quiet. I wanted to talk to you, if you have a moment. Marita motioned for him to sit. What's on your mind, Officer Marks? Brian hesitated before taking the chair across from her desk. He placed his hat on his lap, his eyes darting nervously around the room before settling on her. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about accountability, about change. Marita leaned back, studying him carefully. And I've been on the force for 3 years, Brian continued. In that time, I thought I was doing everything right. I followed the rules, stayed sharp, treated people with respect, or at least I thought I did. But after what happened yesterday, And after sitting through this trial, I'm starting to see things differently." Marita raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, allowing him to continue. Brian's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "I didn't realize how much my own assumptions were shaping the way I approached people. It wasn't until I watched Andrew on the stand, how scared he looked, how vulnerable he was, that I realized I've probably made people feel the same way. Not just you yesterday morning, but others too." Marita folded her hands on the desk. "Self-awareness is a start, Officer Marks. But recognizing the problem is only the first step. What do you plan to do about it?" Brian looked down at his hat, turning it over in his hands. "That's what I'm struggling with," he admitted. "I want to be better, to do better, but I don't know where to begin." Marita regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Officer Marks. It requires consistent effort, challenging your own biases, educating yourself, and holding yourself accountable. More importantly, it requires courage. The courage to speak out when you see injustice, even if it means standing against your peers." Brian nodded, her words sinking in. "I want to do that," he said quietly. I don't know if I have the tools." Marita's expression softened. "You're not alone in this, Officer Marks. There are resources, organizations, and communities dedicated to addressing these issues. Seek them out, learn from them, and remember, the most important changes often start with the smallest actions." Brian stood, his posture more confident than when he had entered. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, "for everything." Marita nodded, watching as he left. She couldn't be certain whether his resolve would last, but she hoped her words had planted a seed. The jury returns. Hours later, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The gallery was packed once more, the air thick with anticipation. Andrew Willis sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Beside him, his attorney, Terence Graves, leaned in, whispering final words of encouragement. Marita resumed her place on the bench, her expression neutral as she addressed the jury foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a solemn expression, stood and cleared her throat. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict," Marita said. The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. "In the matter of Willis versus Vixton County Police Department, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Andrew Willis." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Tears welled up in Andrew's eyes as he turned to Terence, who gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Marita raised her gavel, bringing the room back to order. "The court acknowledges the jury's decision. This trial has highlighted issues that extend far beyond the individuals involved. Let today's verdict serve as a reminder that accountability is not optional, it is essential. Court is adjourned." She struck the gavel, and the room erupted into applause. A quiet victory. As the courtroom emptied, Marita lingered behind, watching as Andrew embraced his family. His mother's tearful joy and his father's quiet pride filled the room with warmth. For a moment, the weight on Marita's shoulders felt a little lighter. This was why she had chosen this path, not for the victories, but for the moments when justice prevailed, however fleeting. A new beginning. Outside the courthouse, Officer Marks stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the protesters celebrate the verdict. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, and a faint glimmer of hope. He thought about Judge Daniel's words, about the courage it would take to challenge the system from within. He didn't know where the path would lead, but for the first time, he felt ready to take the first step. As the chants of the crowd rose around him, Brian turned and walked away, his mind set on becoming the change he wanted to see. Ripples of change. The days following the verdict in Willis v. Vixton County Police Department sent ripples through the small town and far beyond. News outlets across the country picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight for civil rights and police accountability. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions, amplifying voices of outrage, hope, and everything in between. But within the quiet halls of the courthouse, the work continued. For Judge Marita Daniels, the trial's conclusion marked not the end, but the beginning of something deeper, a renewed commitment to justice and a sharper awareness of the systemic flaws that still plagued the system. Sitting at her desk, she sifted through a new stack of cases, each one another reminder of the inequalities that persisted. The victory for Andrew Willis had been monumental, but it was just one case in an endless tide. A new chapter for Andrew. Across town, Andrew Willis found himself adjusting to his newfound recognition. Before the trial, he had been just another teenager, navigating the challenges of school and adolescence. Now, he was seen as a symbol of resilience, a young man who had dared to stand up against an institution many feared to challenge. It was overwhelming at times. Strangers stopped him on the street to offer words of encouragement, and activists reached out, asking him to speak at rallies and events. Andrew wasn't sure he was ready for such a role, but his mother, Janet, encouraged him. "You've got a voice, Andrew," she said one evening as they sat in their modest living room. "And people are listening. Use it." Andrew nodded, though doubt lingered in his mind. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I can't handle it? Janet placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "You've already handled more than most people your age ever will. Just speak your truth, son. That's all anyone can ask." The next weekend, Andrew stood before a crowd at a community rally, his heart pounding as he gripped the microphone. He glanced at his parents, who stood at the edge of the stage, their expressions a mixture of pride and encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm just a kid who wanted to go home after basketball practice. But what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. We can't fix what's broken if we don't talk about it, if we don't face it head on. So let's start talking." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Andrew felt the power of his voice. Officer Marks's transformation. Meanwhile, Officer Brian Marks was quietly undergoing his own transformation. The verdict had shaken him deeply, forcing him to confront not just the biases in the system, but his own complicity in perpetuating them. He began attending community forums and workshops on racial bias, listening to the stories of those who had been harmed by the very institution he had sworn to serve. At first, the conversations were uncomfortable. He felt defensive, even attacked at times. But as he listened, truly listened, he began to see the world through a different lens. He heard from young black men like Andrew, who spoke about the constant fear of being stopped or judged simply for existing. He heard from mothers who worried every time their sons left the house. He heard from colleagues, black officers, who spoke about the double burden of being part of a system that often didn't protect them. One evening, after a particularly intense forum, Brian approached a man who had spoken passionately about his own wrongful arrest. "Excuse me," Brian said, his voice tentative. "I just wanted to say, thank you for sharing your story." The man looked at him, his expression cautious. "What do you mean?" Brian shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, it opened my eyes. I didn't realize how much harm we were causing, even when we thought we were just doing our jobs." The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "Awareness is a start, but it's just a start." "I know," Brian said. "I'm trying to do better." Marita's struggles and resolve. In her chambers, Judge Daniels faced the daunting reality of the system she worked within. Though the verdict in Andrew's case had been a victory, she knew the battle for justice was far from over. Her docket was filled with cases that reflected the same underlying issues: systemic bias, economic inequality, and the criminalization of poverty. One evening, as she reviewed case files late into the night, Marita received a call from a fellow judge, Robert Harris. He was older, a respected figure in the legal community, but his tone carried a note of condescension. "Marita," Harris began, "I've been hearing a lot about that case you just wrapped up. Stirred quite the pot, didn't you?" Marita stiffened. "Justice isn't about avoiding controversy, Robert. It's about doing what's right. Harris chuckled softly. Don't get me wrong. I respect what you're trying to do, but don't let idealism blind you. The system is what it is. You push too hard, and it'll push back. Marita's grip tightened on the phone. The system is what we make it, and if it's broken, it's our duty to fix it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Harris sighed. Be careful, Marita. That's all I'm saying. As the call ended, Marita sat in silence, her resolve hardening. She knew the risks of challenging the status quo: political backlash, professional isolation, even personal attacks. But she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. A new initiative. In the weeks following the trial, Marita began working on a new initiative aimed at addressing the root causes of systemic bias in the justice system. She partnered with local organizations to create a community advisory board, bringing together judges, police officers, activists, and ordinary citizens to discuss reforms. The first meeting was tense. The room was filled with people who, under normal circumstances, might never have spoken to one another. There were heated exchanges, moments of frustration, and even a few walkouts. But by the end of the meeting, a sense of cautious hope began to emerge. Brian Marks attended every meeting, often sitting quietly in the back, taking notes. He found himself drawn to the discussions, particularly those led by Marita. Her ability to bridge divides and keep the conversation focused on solutions inspired him. One evening, after a particularly productive session, Brian approached Marita as she gathered her things. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady, I wanted to thank you. For this. For everything. Marita looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. It's not about me, Officer Marks. It's about all of us. Brian nodded. Still, you've shown me what accountability looks like, and I won't forget it. The ripple effect. Over time, the changes sparked by the trial began to take root. The Vickston County Police Department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. The advisory board proposed policy changes that were met with both resistance and support, but progress, however slow, was being made. Andrew Willis continued to use his voice, becoming a prominent advocate for justice reform. And Officer Brian Marks found himself growing into the kind of officer he had always aspired to be, one who served with integrity and compassion. For Judge Marita Daniels, the work was far from over. But as she stood on the courthouse steps one evening, watching the sun set over the town, she felt a sense of quiet hope. Change was slow, often painfully so, but it was happening. And that was enough. A legacy forged in justice. The chill of winter had crept into Vickston County, and the courthouse steps were dusted with a light layer of snow. Despite the cold, a crowd gathered outside, their breath visible as they spoke in hushed tones. Today marked 6 months since the verdict in Willis v. Vickston County Police Department, and the courthouse was hosting a public forum to discuss the ongoing impact of the trial. Inside, Judge Marita Daniels prepared for the event in her chambers. The past months had been a whirlwind. Media interviews, speaking engagements, and countless meetings with community leaders. The forum was her idea, a way to ensure the momentum sparked by Andrew's case wasn't lost in the churn of the news cycle. She glanced at her desk, where a framed photograph of her grandmother stood. The woman in the picture stared back with fierce determination, holding a protest sign that read, "Equality or Nothing." Marita smiled faintly, brushing a thumb over the frame. "We're getting there, Grandma," she murmured. Andrew finds his voice. In the audience, Andrew Willis sat beside his parents, his fingers tapping nervously on his knee. The past 6 months had been transformative for him. He had gone from being a quiet, unassuming teenager to a vocal advocate for justice reform. Though he had embraced the role, it wasn't always easy. He leaned toward his mother, Janet, who gave him a reassuring squeeze on the arm. "You've got this," she said with a warm smile. "Just speak from the heart." Andrew nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. He had been asked to speak at the forum, his first major address since the rally shortly after the trial. The crowd was larger this time, the stakes higher. When Marita entered the room and took her seat at the panel, the murmurs in the crowd quieted. She looked over the audience, her gaze settling briefly on Ander. She gave him a small nod, a silent encouragement. The event began with a moderator introducing the panel, which included Marita, Officer Brian Marks, and representatives from local advocacy groups. After the introductions, the moderator turned to Ander. "Mr. Willis," she said, "your case has become a symbol of the need for systemic change. How has life changed for you since the trial?" Ander cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he began. "It's been overwhelming, honestly. I never thought my story would reach so many people. Before the trial, I felt invisible, like my life didn't matter. But now, I see that my experience can help shine a light on what so many others go through." He paused, glancing at his parents before continuing. "What happened to me wasn't an accident. It was part of a system that's been broken for a long time. But I've learned that we can't fix it if we don't talk about it, if we don't hold people accountable. That's why I'm here today, because we can't let what happened to me happen to someone else." The room erupted in applause, and Ander's face flushed with a mix of pride and relief. He caught Marita's eye, and she smiled, giving him another nod. Officer Marks speaks up. Next, the moderator turned to Officer Brian Marks, who sat stiffly in his chair. He had wrestled with whether to accept the invitation to speak, knowing the scrutiny he would face. But he had decided to attend, believing it was his responsibility to be part of the solution. "Officer Marks," the moderator began, "your role in this case has been a topic of significant discussion. What lessons have you taken away from the past 6 months?" Brian took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "First, I want to say that I'm still learning. What happened during the trial, and my own actions before it, forced me to confront things I hadn't been willing to see before. I realized how much my own biases influenced the way I approached my job." He paused, glancing at Marita for reassurance. She gave him a steady look, encouraging him to continue. "I've been working to educate myself," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I've attended community workshops, read everything I could get my hands on, and most importantly, listened to the people our system has failed. It's not easy to admit when you've been part of the problem, but it's necessary." The room was silent, the audience hanging on his every word. Brian leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "Policing isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about serving the community. And to do that, we need to rebuild trust, one step at a time. That starts with accountability, from officers like me, from our departments, and from the justice system as a whole." A smattering of applause began, growing into a wave of support. Brian exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he deserved the applause, but he vowed to earn it. Marita's call to action. When the moderator turned to Marita, the energy in the room shifted. She was no longer just a judge. She was a symbol of hope, a reminder that justice could prevail when people refused to back down. "Your Honor," the moderator said, "you've been at the center of this journey. What do you see as the path forward?" Marita leaned forward, her voice steady but impassioned. "The path forward begins with recognizing that justice is not a destination, it's a process. And that process requires all of us to engage, to question, and to demand better." She glanced around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. The verdict in Ander's case was a step in the right direction, but it's only one step. The system we're fighting against didn't break overnight, and it won't be fixed overnight. But that doesn't mean we give up. Her voice grew stronger. "We need to keep pushing, for better training, for transparent policies, for accountability at every level. And we need to keep having these conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they are. Because change doesn't happen in silence." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. Marita's words resonated deeply, a rallying cry for a community determined to fight for justice. Ripples of hope. After the forum, the crowd mingled, exchanging stories and ideas. Andrew found himself surrounded by people offering praise and encouragement. His parents beamed with pride, their son no longer just a teenager, but a symbol of resilience. Officer Marks stood near the back of the room, watching quietly. A young black man approached him, his expression cautious. "Officer Marks," the man said, extending a hand. "I wanted to say, I respect what you said up there. It takes guts to admit when you're wrong." Brian shook the man's hand, his gratitude evident. "Thank you. It means a lot."